There we go. I'll tilt it like that. So I'm Mike. Very good to meet you. It is beautiful in Santiago. It's very cold back in Texas, which happens like once per year. So happy to be here. Today I'm going to talk about creating developers from scratch. And not in like a creepy Sweeney Todd kind of a way, but in more of a training kind of a way. So this is actually an extension of a lightning talk I gave, I guess, 6 months ago or thereabouts, called Why Hire a Developer When You Can Hire a Barista and Teach Them How to Code. So how many of you out there have been baristas in the past? Yeah, me too, all right. So in 2009, I quit Starbucks. I had always kind of been programming games, and I never really thought that was a career you could do. And for me, it really wasn't. I do web stuff now, right? But it got me excited about it, and Starbucks, while having taught me so many great skills, was still not as good as getting a tech salary. So I wanted to help out as many other people as I could, and I also wanted to hire as cheap as I could, because when I started my business in 2012, I had no money. We were completely bootstrapped. So before you can really get to the bottom of why bother training someone rather than hiring someone that already has the skills, you kind of have to ask yourself, why am I hiring someone in the first place? And that's going to depend on who you are. So if you're a technical manager and you have enough of a kind of recent set of developer skills, you can go talk to a developer and you can figure out, okay, this person's going to maybe help me scale my team and move a little bit faster. And you might even be able to kind of know what sort of developers you're hiring for or what kind of skills and experience you need. But if you're completely non-technical, then you really can't, right? You have no idea who to hire. And this advice, this talk, this experiment, I guess you could say, is not really for people who don't have any developers yet at all, right? You shouldn't just go try to hire baristas and say, hey, I need you to build this web platform from scratch, and maybe you could do it for 300 pesos, and it needs to be done by next week. There's lots of ads like that on Craigslist, fewer and fewer every year, which is great. But that's not what this is about. This is where you already have someone technical on your team, and you're trying to solve the problem of I can't do it fast enough, or I can't do it at all. So maybe you need to add some machine learning features to your product. Maybe you look to someone that has some AI experience, right? Maybe you need to do something with hardware. You look to someone who's done some IoT stuff. But it all comes down to the fact that you can't do it by yourself, and you can't do it fast enough, even if you could do it all by yourself. So over the past, I guess, 7 years now, I've hired, I think, somewhere close to 30 people, which isn't a lot. We're a small team, and so there's been a lot of phases to our development. But out of these 30 or so phases, about half of them I taught to code, either from scratch or nearly from scratch. A lot of people, at least in the US, get some HTML in school when they're actually in middle school, which helps quite a bit because they've seen markup before. But other than that, these people were blank slates. They don't know what an if statement is. They don't know what a for loop is. Nothing. And that's going to change the next generation, because I hear stories from little kids talking about for loops in school. So that's going to be a big deal. But we still got a few years before those guys grow up big enough to help us out with our projects legally. So when you think about the reasons that you're going to hire somebody, you see, oh, I need that AI thing, or oh, I need that IoT thing. And it's kind of like this iceberg floating above the surface. But underneath that, there's all of these other reasons that you actually need to hire that you can't even really see. And those are where the baristas are going to come in. The barista is not going to go play a sales engineer in a sales meeting for you. They're not going to decide what framework you're going to use for your products. They can barely open a text editor, right? They're not ready for that. But there's plenty of other stuff they can help with, and we'll come back to that in a second. So you have these business needs, this constellation of business needs, right? And if you look at this little circle here, pretend that's someone's skill set, right? I'm going to step over here for a second. So if it's this wide, then I can cover maybe 3 requirements, the white stars. And maybe if I had a little bit more experience, I could cover more of the business needs, more of the requirements. So maybe those 3 stars is like 2 years of coding experience. And maybe if I had 10 years of coding experience, I would have this breadth, this wide knowledge about how to do all kinds of different things. And then maybe I could cover all of your business requirements. But I would also cost more money, right? And you can only hire so many people at that price point, not to mention the fact that they'd all be arguing with each other all the time. But then you think of a barista, and they can't cover any of those stars, right? Like, they don't actually know how to do any of it yet. But those stars are the part above the iceberg, right? So like you're looking at what you need to do, and there's so many more things that you aren't seeing that the baristas, with a little bit of help, can actually handle. And as they gain more and more knowledge, they can sort of help you out more and more with actual above-the-surface business needs. So maybe from day one, they don't know how to build new web pages or email templates, but within like a month, they can be creating PDF templates, HTML pages, getting into doing some of the, if you're using Vue.js, like VIFs or Angular, NGIFs, et cetera. And they can enjoy those things, right? So if I have to sit there and make a new HTML page, I'm going to get like super distracted about which of my CSS rules needs to come first, and I'll spend like 20 minutes worrying about that, and it's pointless. There's no point in me doing that. But someone who's doing it for the very first time, like, they're just happy to see the code work. They're just happy to see something show up on the page. The other thing is that these apprentices, these baristas, they don't have the bad habits yet that you develop over the years. And sometimes bad habits to one person can be like really good habits to someone else. And really the whole idea is that your team is this patchwork of everyone's skills and experience who's on it. And the more everybody can work together and write consistent code and build consistent features and UI, the better your product's going to be. So if you can kind of have control and mold someone to fit the needs of your team, that's even better than hiring somebody who had a lot of general knowledge. So the feedback I usually get when I bring this up, and people, especially with our customers who hire our team, is like, well, doesn't that distract the developers, right? Like helping these newbies learn all the time? Does that slow you down? And the answer is like, yeah, totally. It slowed us down like numerous times, and it's taken us a while to figure out how to not let that happen. If you assign the wrong user stories to entry-level apprentices, right, basically baristas, they're not going to succeed. And they're going to ask so many questions that they're going to eat up like days and days of your more senior developers' time. So you can't do that. That's just not on the table. And you also have to be clear that like this isn't about teaching people. Like that isn't really the goal here when you hire somebody. You're not hiring them so that they'll have an opportunity to go earn a proper developer salary someday. That's a side effect and it's awesome. But the reason you hire someone is to create business value and to create better customer experiences. And fortunately, when you hire a barista, there's all of this other work to do. So I'm going to give you some examples. I've blacked out all of the confidential information, I hope, from these examples. So imagine day one, right? And we'll come back to, there's a few training things that need to be addressed right from the get-go, just sort of expectations about proprietary software and understanding what you can and can't say to a client or to other stakeholders. But pretty much from day one, if you need to go in and configure, let's say, this is in Zoho, a workflow, that's super annoying for me. Like I hate going in there and dragging and dropping and like adding conditions and doing ands and ors. But it's intuitive and people can figure it out. It's designed for business users, but the business usually doesn't want to actually do this work. So we end up doing it. And rather than spending our senior developers' time to do this stuff, we pass that on to our apprentices, who get to learn a ton from the process. Same kind of thing, there's all these sorts of accounts that we set up when we do a new project. So We build a Chrome user, we do custom bookmarks in that Chrome user, and we link to the same places every time, right? We link to the sales documentation page, we link to what we call the cloud map, which is this spreadsheet, where we kind of list where all of the different assets of the project live. A lot of people do this in like Confluence as well. But the baristas can do all this stuff, right? The very first time, you kind of have to handhold them through the process. But once they've seen it once, they can run with it. Another thing we rely on our apprentices for is time tracking. So we don't really track hours at SalesCo. The way we work is we estimate stuff with story points, right? Like an agile process. And nonetheless, in between sprints, sometimes when we have a gap, we still help our customers maintain their apps. And so someone has to go in there when something comes in, right? Maybe it's, a lot of people call them tickets. We call it the red phone. There's a little flashing light in our office that starts going off. And that means either paper trail is logged an error of some kind of 500 error, or there's been like someone has a question, right, from the business. So rather than us going in and estimating those really, really small stories that get automatically created in Trello, we have our apprentices do that for us. And we kind of round robin that work. On a similar note, also in Slack in this case, we have these paper trail notifications come in that hit our red phone channel, make the party light go off, start spinning. And that someone has to answer those things, right? And someone has to say, hey, that was a test order, that wasn't a real customer. Or, hey, that was totally a real customer and actually order number 456 was affected and all their data is ruined, right? And then maybe this person won't actually solve that problem yet, but they'll start the process. And it means that the senior developers on your team don't have to like look up, switch to Slack, figure out what's going on, look up the ID from the error message in the production database, check that out in the CRM, and try to figure out some way to convert that into business-friendly language. Another thing that apprentices can do pretty much from day one is what I call reconnaissance. So maybe that's UI research, competitor research. Maybe it's just like sending an email to someone that you're working with. If I don't feel like sending an email, or if I'm busy working on something else, I'll just sort of yell out and ask for help. And one of our apprentices will do that for me, right? Some examples here, actually, more on the legal side, recently we've been working on making new sales projects that we generate with Sales New be GDPR compliant for people in Europe. And so one of our apprentices created this Google Doc, kind of compared the language and figured out what we would need to do to make that possible. And it turns out basically all we had to do was change our privacy policy a little bit. But it's something I've been avoiding for like 6 months because it sounded really boring and wasn't going to do it, right? But an apprentice can do that in a day or less. Another example here, so if in this case, comparing two different UIs, like, hey, how do they do search, right? How does Gmail do search? How does Slack do search? How does Salesforce do search? Coming back and presenting that information in a concise way. And that was a pretty standard thing you would see at like design shops with junior designers, but not a super common thing you see on the dev side of the house. But apprentices can do that because that doesn't require a ton of design experience. You just have to like have used search before. Again, similar thing, this time though for vendors, right, or for partners. If you're trying to figure out, okay, what should I use for reporting? Should I use like Bro or Tableau, or should I use Microsoft BI? And like, I don't understand their pricing, and like some of them don't list the pricing at all on their website. Like that, for a lot of developers, especially me, like that sounds super annoying. I don't want to send that email and say, hey, I'm really polite and I want you to tell me the price, right? Why don't you just list it on your website? That's kind of how I normally feel about that. But apprentices get the opportunity to learn all kinds of stuff about what that new product is. For them, maybe it's the first time they've ever even seen a BI tool or business intelligence tool. So it's a big deal, and it doesn't take any of your developers' time. Okay, so now getting a little bit more into the actual code, because all that stuff is nice, but you can kind of have like an intern do everything so far. But if you have your apprentices doing quality assurance and doing QA, and you have them in there using the stuff that you're building, they have the opportunity to, if you encourage this behavior, right, they have the opportunity to help catch weird stuff, like stuff that would never be important enough to really get estimated or added to a sprint, but stuff that, like, yeah, it could be better, right? And if it's brought up in the right way to business stakeholders, then they might actually care, and they might actually make that user experience better when normally it wouldn't have happened otherwise. So in this case, one of our apprentices, hey, I noticed the browser back button doesn't respond on the package or individual service details pages, depending on how many times you open or close the modals. Like closing the modals 3 times will require 3 non-responsive browser back attempts. Then the 4th will go back to the overview page. So this is all super specific, right? And out of context, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But it's showing that, like, hey, there's something that you can do that you probably won't do, but if you do it, it's going to be weird. And rather than that being a bug report later, let's just go ahead and solve it. Another thing that once you have your apprentices in there helping with QA is they can help you organize your Agile board. So what we do every sprint is we prepare a demo session, right? And we do our sprint review and our retrospective. But what we found when we do that, it's helpful for the business to understand how the different story points were spent. So some of these Trello cards, in our case, end up being kind of complicated or like are very specific and focused, like the new client wizard minus autocompletes. You know, for a business user, that might not make a ton of sense. So we lump that all together under like clients page, and then they can see a breakdown of, okay, here's how much we spent basically on the clients page. Here's how much we spent on the ticket details page. Here's how much we spent on the jurisdictions page. Here's how much we spent just wireframing what we're going to do next sprint. Okay, and now the real meat of it, and this is the part that I've been kind of informally doing with people since 2012, which is HTML and CSS, and kind of training people that don't have any actual imperative like coding experience to be able to build these things. Because it's super visual, and they figure it out really quick. So that means HTML and CSS anywhere you would use it. Like if you're creating email templates in a lot of tools, you can use HTML and CSS obviously to put those together. There's some different rules around that, and that requires some training. But once they have these HTML and CSS skills, they are super effective at being able, it kind of opens up this whole other world of possibilities. So it makes it so that they can start doing changes, right? Which is kind of scary, so you have to set up some ground rules around that. But those changes can be super useful. And again, just going back to the little things that you might not notice or quite care enough about or have enough time to solve, your apprentices can see that, and for them, it's an opportunity to do maybe their first pull requests, right? Or it's their opportunity to try out something new that they just learned in CSS. So in this case, adding placeholder text on focus into a search field to make it more clear that it's clickable and what you're supposed to use it for. And again, there's some other small things you might never get around to doing otherwise, like maybe a success state after you finish a form in your modal. You know, maybe you just had it closing, and then you were asked by the business, hey, can we just throw some text in there? It'll be fine, whatever you think, right? And so you just slap some stuff down in there, and you move on to the other priority work you're working on. Well, your apprentices see that, and they see an opportunity to make it better, right? And to kind of leave their mark on this thing that we're all creating together. So the next level after that, and this is where it starts to get a little bit more tricky, and you have to get into some more theory with them. But we've had a lot of success this year for the first time, taking people who still don't really know completely how to write JavaScript or any programming language to be able to create custom forms, validations, modal windows, and basic UI components that are interactive. And obviously, you need some tooling to make that possible so that you're not having to do complicated stuff to like slam that stuff on the page and remove it. But if you have all that infrastructure in place, it turns out people are actually pretty good at it. The naming is going to be weird sometimes, right? Because people have never learned those hard lessons about, okay, you need to use explicit names or it's going to be confusing later, or you can't just make everything an abbreviation because it's going to conflict with other abbreviations that other people on your team have made. But that's okay because this stuff is all confined, right? You're not saying, hey, can you make this really essential component in the app that's going to be used on all of the pages? You're saying like, no, hey, can you do this new page, or like, can you do this new form that only shows up in one place? And that way, any problems are confined, right? And they're kind of like locked inside this one page. Or actually, another example, we recently had to make different forms for different states in the United States. And this involved like a lot of manual HTML coding and interactivity too. So it's not just the HTML, it's, you know, when you choose yes for this question appears. Or when you choose no, that question has to go away. And the answer has to not be sent to the server still, right? And it has to no longer be required. And so all of that stuff takes some amount of wiring up for interactivity. So another thing, and I put this here in the presentation because it seems like something you could give an apprentice like early on in the process, but I found that they usually don't succeed when you try to assign the task of wireframing too early on. And I think it's just hard for folks to be able to visualize how something needs to change if they haven't ever created a web page themselves. But once you have people able to create HTML and CSS, you can ask them, hey, would you wireframe what you think this needs to look like? So in this case, we wanted an icon next to the status in this ticket UI here. And originally, Raquel here came back with some kind of icon or a bomb icon. Then I asked, hey, maybe we could do something a little bit more conventional. And then here's the boring triangle. So we kind of communicate with wireframes. And even though Raquel is totally capable of just putting that in the code, I don't want her to have to change it in the code because that's really defeating, right? It sucks to have to change something you just did. And you're probably seeing a pattern here, like assigning people things that you know they are not necessarily going to succeed on is kind of a bad experience and it can create cultural problems. So another category that's starting to get into a little bit of a different area, equally technical, but also heavily dependent on service experience, is kind of doing stuff on the fly when customers, say for example, you're at a conference in Chile, and something comes up with one of your customers, and you're not around, right? Maybe you don't have the internet at the moment. Our apprentices can jump in and handle solutions for that problem. So like in this case, there was a problem with team accounts, right? There was a user trying just to have a normal account represent their entire team. And so Raquel here was able to come back and say, hey, I put something on the roadmap about that, but maybe what you could do for now is just have them use a plus sign in their email address, and then they'll get the email. And that's something that she learned from doing QA, because it doesn't take very long of doing QA to learn that you can just create random email addresses with plus signs, and they'll all go to the same place. Similarly, like if the business needs a special report, an apprentice can go in and pull that from our tools without necessarily having to involve a developer. At a certain point, they will, right? It's handling maybe 50% of the times this comes up. But like after a while, that 50% really adds up. If it's happening once a week, now that's one time a week, you don't have to deal with that, right, as a developer. And that's more code you can be writing. And now so open source stuff is kind of specific for our team because we maintain a large open source framework. And also we don't get paid for it, so it kind of gets deprioritized in the grand scheme of things versus the things we need to stay alive and eat and pay our rent. So, but it's still this huge problem, right? That's always floating out there. So what we do on our team is when our apprentices hit that downtime where they don't actually know what to do next, they go and they solve 3 GitHub issues, or they at least respond, right? And they try their best to help. And we track that on our side, and then we do follow-ups for things that seem critical. So they're kind of in charge of triage and controlling what gets looked at by the developers on our team. Okay, on a similar note to the reports thing, we're not going and teaching these apprentices SQL. I barely know how to write code or SQL myself, it seems like, half the time. Or anytime I try to write a custom query, I just feel like, how could I have forgotten this stuff? And there's a reason why we wrote an ORM. But anyways, what they can do is go into a tool like SQL Pro, or let's say for those of us that are older, like maybe PHP MyAdmin, and go in there and just grab data. And so the most common time this comes up is when there's an error, and you go and you look at the stack trace, and you see an ID of like a user or an order, and you go and you look that up in the database. And normally, that would be one of our senior developers having to do that work. But if an apprentice does that work, you immediately take this automated notification. You have someone else on your team that can like convert that into something meaningful for the business, and we didn't even have to get involved, right? We could automate that, but it would take a bunch of time in the business and would never spend the money to do it because it's sort of abstract. Whereas we can pay someone at the apprentice level to do that for us and do it well. Another area, and this is sort of a new thing we've been doing. Right now, we have not had a lot of success with this for people that are not at least boot camp level trained, largely because we just haven't really spent the time to build the curriculum to train people on HTTP requests and responses. That's something we're kind of in the middle of working on now. But if for apprentices that have been through the boot camp level, there's a lot of stuff that goes into integrating with a third-party API. A lot of it affects the business. And most of it is really boring to me, right? And not really something I want to spend my time doing, and not something that the business wants to pay for me to spend my time doing. So by involving apprentices, they get to learn, okay, how do I use Postman? How do I read this API doc? Like, how do I consume this endpoint and get data from it? Or how do I like cause some action to happen in QuickBooks? How can I mark an invoice as paid in QuickBooks? How can I mark this property as sold in like an MLS system, which is a real estate thing in the US. And it allows them to basically build Postman collections. Let's cover that for a second there. That's what this thing is here on the bottom, is an export of a Postman collection. For those of you who haven't seen it before, Postman is like this curl client, but with a GUI. So you can go and do it with point and click. And it's actually pretty intuitive, and that part at least we've had a lot of luck with just everybody in the team being able to use. Reading the API docs can sometimes be another matter because they're pretty dense sometimes. But we're getting better at it. And then, okay, so the biggest thing, right, and probably the most immediate value add you're going to get from hiring even just one apprentice is putting them to work on QA. And you could hire a QA professional to do this, which would be awesome, right? And if you're at the point in your product where you have buy-in to make that happen, and you're not just getting buy-in to hire developers, then that's awesome. But there is in a lot of products I've worked on, there's this point in time where like you can't actually get them to hire a QA person yet. And that's where but you can get them to hire a developer, and they really want to hire a developer. So if you can hire someone at the apprentice level and have them play the role of QA, it unlocks so much productivity from your existing developers because they're not having to do that. And plus you're catching so many things that would have just been shipped into production. And for those of you that do this kind of stuff every day, you know, if you ship something into production that's going to corrupt data, right, on accident, maybe you accidentally, maybe it mangles some embedded JSON, or maybe it like deletes join records or something that it shouldn't. Now you have this crazy task of going in and trying to figure out what orders or users were affected and like repairing that data. That can be largely mitigated, or you know, some of the time at least, if you have more people looking at the code, and specifically looking at the end product and making sure there isn't weird behavior with fake orders and fake users before you start doing the real thing. How many of you would call yourself developers, by the way, out there? Those hands up there. All right. So you know, a good portion. And if you think about what your day-to-day is like, you may have kind of like a warped perspective, right? I feel like I have a warped perspective of what my day-to-day as a developer is like, because I am so focused on the tasks that I'm doing. And I'm usually not thinking about how could I take pieces of what I'm doing right now and give that work to someone else. I'm not thinking like a manager because I'm too busy trying to build a great product, right? But if you do a little bit of that thinking, even if you're not a manager, right? If you're a manager, then yeah, you should be doing that thinking. But if you're not, there's a lot of work that you can delegate and that you can hand off and get great results on that will save you a ton of time and basically allow you to get more work done in your day. And that's been my experience anyway. And every team is different, right? If money is no object and your only goal is achieving features as quickly as possible and getting those out the door, then it doesn't necessarily mean that hiring a bunch of developers is actually going to work and solve that problem directly. And there's a lot of reasons for that we shouldn't get into in this talk, I think. But at the end of the day, hiring an apprentice could still have value, even if you have all the money in the world, right? So what I found to be useful in managing these apprentices themselves, in order to kind of reap the maximum value and make sure that everyone is happy in the workplace, well, one is celebrating when apprentices are able to catch things that maybe we wouldn't have caught without them. And even if those things are insignificant, even if it's just some placeholder text that maybe was missing and should be there, like that can feel annoying. You hear that and you're like, oh man, it's not worth it. But that's because you're still thinking like, oh, I have to fix it, But like a lot of times they can just fix it for you. Or at the very least, they can track that work and it can get fixed in a future pass. Another thing that's been important for us since we've started using this for all of our projects has been that they need a way to let you know when they're done with whatever tasks they've been assigned, right? So you can have passive tasks, and like for us, we have the open source work that's like never ending, right? There's like something like 15 new issues every day. They just keep coming. And some of them are questions, some of them are actually just blank, right? Sometimes some of them are like super legit bugs too that need to be looked at by someone with a little bit more experience. But still, if I just was to turn over and say, okay guys, everybody just work on open source whenever you're done, you lose that communication path that tells you, hey, this task got finished, right? And you can try to processize that, but my experience has been that it doesn't usually work very well, that you don't always find out. Maybe you're not even the manager, maybe you're a developer, and an apprentice comes up to you and says, hey, like I noticed that the placeholder text was missing, and you're like, yeah, no, that is totally true. That placeholder text is missing, and it really should be there. It's weird that it's not there. You want to take a pass at it? And they're like, yeah, I want to take a pass at that. So they do that, and then they might disappear, right? And that's not good, because you want to know like what files they're editing right now. What else are you changing? What problems are going to come down the line because of that? Because of what I just asked you to do. And you can work to. And I think that's actually one of my other points here. Yeah, so like you want to set clear expectations about code ownership to help avoid these problems. And you want to make it clear that like, hey, okay, these are the files that are safe to edit. The pages that you created HTML and CSS for, like for a period of time, they're still safe to edit on master even, or on your branch. But you do want to draw some lines, and if only just to protect your developer's sanity, so they're not having to deal with the code changing out from under them. And that's true in general, really, across teams, regardless of whether you have apprentices or not. Another thing that we learned actually pretty late in the game is that normally when someone says, hey, we're going to have a planning meeting, we're going to add some new features, it's going to be really great, it's going to be like 4 or 5 hours, but there'll be lunch, so I hope you can make it. Normally I try to cut out as many developers from those meetings as I can, right, to save money, because it's a huge waste of resources if we bring all of the people on the team that can write production code into the same room and have them sit there and space out, right? But apprentices, first of all, care more because there's so much they can learn from being in those meetings that maybe they've never even been exposed to before. And they also, you can afford to have them be in those meetings. And aside from just the benefits that they get individually, it also means that now you have these people amongst your team who have heard all the same stuff that you heard as the person that was in that meeting, and they can help disseminate that information to the other developers in your team. So the next thing that comes up, and is actually a pretty hard one to solve, and we're still working on making this consistently work, is for people, for your developers in your team that don't have management experience, it can sometimes be like pulling teeth to get them to delegate tasks themselves. But for those of you that have scaled teams before, like you know that you can't like personally get in there and try to make that delegation happen, because then that's all you'll be doing in your day, and you have other responsibilities as well. So if you can get your senior developers to delegate the work, and starting with specific things, right? It's like starting with non-coding things. That's the easiest thing to motivate people with, because those are the most annoying things for developers in a lot of cases. Then it's great, because now you're actually gaining advantages, not just from the things that you ask the apprentice to do, but all of the other people on your team are asking the apprentice to help with other tasks. And you're starting to fill up their schedule. You're preventing them from kind of feeling left out or having a lot of downtime in their day. And you're also just saving more time, more money. Another thing that we learned this year, I think, since we've been just so focused on this approach, has been that it's never a good idea to assign a really business-critical task to an apprentice unless you're like pretty sure that they're going to succeed. The main reason being that like then they're going to be really sad if they don't succeed, and it's going to affect their performance and just the mood that they're bringing to the table going forward. You have to keep in mind that like normally developers have a lot of autonomy. They know what they're doing. They know how they can contribute. And so you don't really have to worry about this problem quite as much. You just have to keep them challenged, keep them engaged. The same thing is true for apprentices. But if you give them work that's too hard, then they're going to face constant failure. And that's not what we want either, right? Not to mention the fact that now you have all of these problems that you have to fix in the code later. So you want to be 99% sure that they're going to be successful before you assign a task. And you want to be able to say, hey, that's a really good job afterwards. Another thing that has been helpful for us as far as keeping people motivated and keeping people showing up to work has been setting sort of an informal time window for when you're going to like graduate, like when you get your letter jacket, right? And you can kind of move on to who knows what, like maybe being a developer, maybe being a developer at a different company, maybe at this company, but where you're no longer going to be an apprentice. And that gives you some kind of goalposts. A lot of people that are interested in this kind of work are people that might be interested in going to a boot camp, but they're also people that might be interested in going back to school. They might be interested in getting a teaching job. They might be interested in becoming a manager at Starbucks, right? And they have to weigh the value proposition, because a manager at Starbucks, you can make like a little bit more money than being a barista at Starbucks. But being a software developer, you make like a lot more money. And if you can see a path that'll get you pretty close to that in 2 years, and you get paid to do it, and that's like really compelling, right, for a lot of people. And the last thing I'll say on this topic is that it's important not to skimp on actual training hours. And by that I mean, actually, it's similar to the experience I had. I also used to work at Whataburger, which is like a hamburger chain in the United States. And a big difference I noticed when I was an employee at Whataburger versus an employee at Starbucks was that at Whataburger, the first day I showed up, I was given this tray of ketchup, and I would just like take the ketchup out to people and offer them ketchup, and I didn't learn anything at all. Whereas at Starbucks, the first day, I got paid to sit down and taste different drinks and like learn about what I was going to be creating, and then go and actually make a drink myself with a learning coach. And those were like pretty similar, like pay grade, right? Those jobs are not really all that different, but one of those jobs left me feeling way more fulfilled and way better about what I was doing. And so when I think about hiring apprentices for tech positions, it's the same stuff applies, right? So like you can't just say like, you can't throw them in and say, hey, here's this thing, it's called Zoho, you'll figure it out. Can you set up a new workflow? Because they're just going to be overwhelmed and they're going to quit. As long as you can focus on training skills that are going to be valuable to your team, not in like 3 years, but like in a month, then it's totally worth it to invest 2 weeks of pay to do paid training for someone. You do have an opportunity cost with whoever is doing the training, but in a lot of cases, you can kind of do 1 hour lecture, let's say, and then give them some exercises to follow up with. And I'll close out the talk with some examples of that. And if you're interested, follow up after, and I can send those over to you. Okay, so training apprentices. This is going to be a bit of a rush here because we're getting close to the end of the time. And I guess before I start, keep in mind that what you're trying to solve by training an apprentice is to improve the amount of value that they're creating without having to really invest quite as much time in building their skill set. Becoming like a senior developer takes a ton of reps. It takes a ton of practice, and it takes a ton of failure. And you also have to have had a lot of ownership over code to really be successful at taking on responsibility. And that's just not really going to be the most valuable thing for your business, to train someone in all of that stuff.
Mike?
Yeah.
We have time because we started a little bit earlier, so you don't have to rush it.
Oh, cool. Okay. So we have a little bit more time, actually. But I'll keep it short because this stuff, you'll see, there's like a lot. So, okay. So there's a few different kinds of training that I've like seen and done basically as a manager. So the most common kind is like what I experienced at Whataburger, where it's ad hoc, it's scattered. You assign someone a task like handing out the ketchup. They go to hand out the ketchup, and someone says, "Hey, could I get some mayonnaise?" And then you're just like, "What do I do? I don't know." And you haven't even been told that like a good idea would be to say yes always, right? This is the first rule of customer service, but you don't have that experience yet. You don't have that theory. So ad hoc training is when you take the tray of ketchup back to the person who looks like they know what they're doing the most in the kitchen. You say, "Hey, they want mayonnaise, what do I do?" And that person then has to stop making orders, stop doing what they're doing, and help you. And if they don't know the answer because you didn't know who to ask, they then have to help you find the right person. And now you've got 3 people trying to get someone some mayonnaise, right? And now you have like orders stacking up, and you're wasting money and time and all this stuff. So that's not the best way to learn. It actually isn't that much worse for the apprentice, right? Because they still eventually at the end of the day learn what to do about the mayonnaise. But for the business, it's kind of bad, right? It's a loss. So we avoid that when possible. Another kind of training is like, "Hey, I'll set this up for you while you watch." And this is mostly, we've eliminated this now, but it still comes up every now and then for stuff like, "Hey, I just bought you a Mac. You've never used a Mac before, so let's talk about it," right? Or, "Hey, I just installed this text editor on your computer. Let me show you how I did that." And that's been mostly replaced by videos. So whether you're able to plug into an existing course, in our case, we recorded a video course, and we were able to use those videos, which was actually super awesome and something I never would have thought of if we weren't just recording the course anyways. But even just outside of the value to the Node.js and Sales.js community, like having those videos saves me a ton of time because I'm not teaching someone how to use the terminal for the first time, right? Another kind of training is what I call drills, which is basically homework, right? It's work that doesn't really add any business value, or it's super low priority stuff. Maybe you're going to need a marketing site for some crazy idea that your CEO had. And he's sort of been talking about it every few months, but it's like not important at all. You could like give that marketing website to an apprentice to be their first website, right? Because what's the worst that's going to happen? It'll be kind of ugly, but it wasn't going to get done otherwise, so why not? You can also get them to make their own website, and that's something that we've done a lot in the past because then they care a lot and they kind of get that experience of being a product owner. And those are great. Those are essential. You obviously can't do it all the time because you don't gain any business value from doing that. But that's an essential part of teaching someone to code. And then last but not least, what seems sort of not that important, and I think actually is pretty important, is just some theory. So what that means usually is kind of a lecture, but mostly saying, "Hey, sit down on the computer, and I'm going to tell you what steps to follow, and we're going to build some HTML, and we're going to learn about like normal flow and display block and display inline, and then we're going to learn about like horizontal centering, right? And how you center those 2 different kinds of elements. Because that way, when you're debugging later, you'll understand why your text is centered, but the other stuff isn't centered. Right? So some examples of drills: watching the first section of this video course and setting everything up on your computer, shadowing on a few stand-up meetings with clients, making a personal website for yourself, however much you can get done in a day. using HTML and CSS, deploying that to Heroku, and showing that to the team. And the reason why that is even possible for someone who's never actually opened a text editor is because they've already watched the videos by the time we assign that drill. Some more examples for when they're a little bit further along. So when you've got someone that knows HTML and CSS, there's this chasm that opens up in a lot of cases between HTML and actually writing like imperative logic. And a great way with kind of the modern frameworks like React and Vue is you can teach them how to use like the vif and velse if, or like an Angular ngIf, right? And you can teach them the concept of if-then statements in HTML. And that we've had like a lot of luck with that. They get confused about else a lot of times, and you see just a lot of unnecessary ifs. But other than that, they do great. And so this drill is actually designed to help them like understand that part. There's a few schools of things worth teaching ahead of time. And I'm not going to get into the details of each one, but I'll give you a super high level, right? So there's sort of the essential tools and expectations. So that means this is what GitHub is, and this Git is not the same thing. Also, Java and JavaScript aren't the same thing. Also, this is what a text editor is and how you install it on your computer. And this is the .profile file from my computer that you're supposed to use. And here are the hotkeys that we're going to use on your computer, so you have the same hotkeys as everyone else on the apprentices team. And here's how you log into Heroku. Here's how you install Node.js, et cetera. Then there's kind of this other school of topics about things like thinking like an engineer. So that's everything from what is Agile, like what does it mean to have a stand-up meeting, what is a sprint. You don't need to know like all the details, just like in 5 minutes. Hey, like Agile is this thing we do to be more productive, and otherwise it kind of sucks. So that means we have these meetings every day, except on Monday of the first week we do planning, and on Friday of the second week we do a sprint review and retrospective. Bam, okay. Then there's also all these tools, right? Like, so incognito mode in the terminal. That's not really something that developers specifically need to know, but it's something that you learn from doing QA, and it's super useful when you're doing QA. Also stuff like Chrome users, using the hotkey to take a screenshot and put it directly in your clipboard so you can paste it in Slack or paste that in Trello. Like, man, that's huge. That saves so much time. And if you know that from the get-go, it's like these people are able to do things that I would normally, like that all of our, maybe a UX person wouldn't even necessarily know how to do in like a fraction of the time, right? And also a little bit higher level stuff like the importance of being thorough and the importance of looking for edge cases and really stressing right from the day one at the workplace that like we really care about that. Like if you find an edge case and bring that forward, like that's really valuable to us. That saves everybody time. And even if we're sort of resentful in the moment, know that like we appreciate you and we love you for telling us that. Then more practically, there's kind of 3 areas that come up. One, the DOM, right? So HTML, CSS, what is the DOM? What is normal flow? There's kind of what is display block, display inline? How do you center things? Then there's part 2, which is floats. What is floats? Why is my height messed up? Okay, you can use clear or you can use overflow auto, but really it's easier just to use overflow auto because clear is complicated. Okay, and then part 3 is z-index, position absolute. Why don't my z-indexes work? What does position absolute and position relative mean? And explaining all that. Logic is saying, hey, I want some HTML not to show up all the time, basically. And then, hey, I want some things to repeat. And then, hey, I want to have some dynamic data, and I want to handle the case where it either exists or it doesn't, and maybe use like a ternary operator. And then last but not least, which is kind of our newest area that we're venturing into teaching people, is HTTP and the internet. So understanding what is a request? Okay, there's headers, there's a body, there's the URL and the method, right? What's a response? Okay, there's headers, there's the response body, and there's the status code. And that's it. It's really pretty simple. You don't need to understand header encoding. I don't remember how header encoding works. I don't even understand cookies, basically. So, but those tools allow you to do things like read API docs, and you can just hand someone an API doc instead of you having to go in there and like figure out what's going on with tokens and the QuickBooks API, and like whether they have a way where you don't have to go every 3 months and like reset the token. You can hand that off to an apprentice, and they can figure all that out once they have that knowledge. And we've at least tested that with boot camp level experience and had success. We're working to take that further back. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that I'd be happy to share if just approach me afterwards. We have it all in like a big Trello board. We kind of organize it like you might organize a university course schedule. So there's kind of the initial onboarding stuff. There's Engineering 101 Agile, Engineering 102 Quality, Customer Service, Productivity. Each one of these has breakdowns. These are my notes that I use when I train someone, basically. Teamwork, red phone etiquette. Always letting people know that you are looking at what they reported, that you've looked at their question and that you're working on it. The DOM, there's a lot of stuff on the DOM. I'm not going to cover all that. We already kind of talked about it. But it also gets into stuff like mixins and color variables in whatever framework you're using, like Stylus or Sass or less. Semantic markup versus the Bootstrap framework, which is always the thing that makes me cringe, but we still use Bootstrap. And teaching them to use browser stack, teaching them to do browser testing, helping them understand what paper trail is, and helping them understand what rollbar is and what those notifications mean. Then logic, understanding dynamic data, if-then statements as parallel universes, loops, and then short circuiting, or that little thing where you do ampersand, ampersand, or pipe, pipe. And then finally, our most experimental stuff, HTTP and the internet, which we've already kind of touched on. So does this work, right? And the short answer is like, yeah, because we haven't gone out of business yet. So we're hanging in there. We definitely learned a lot of lessons, and we've wasted a lot of time doing things the wrong way. We've been training people and hiring people that don't have coding experience for, I guess, 7 years now. In the last year, we've committed to all new people we hire being this way. And I think the first advice I would give is if you're going to try this out, just start with one apprentice, because I don't want you to trust me. I want you to just try it for a month and then see the value, which you should see very quickly. Another thing is if you're like, hey, I really like this, I want to hire a bunch of these guys, try to only train one of them at once, because even though it seems like people would be able to help each other and you kind of create this classroom environment, it also creates just this environment of confusion and fear a little bit, because you have people that don't understand what to do, and their cohort doesn't really know the answer either. And it's better if you can spend all of your attention on one person at a time. Imagine if public schools worked that way. Like, that would be awesome. But you can at least create that in your company. So since going all in with this approach, in 2017, we've shipped more quality features, emphasis on quality features, than we ever have before. Our overall visible velocity, think of that iceberg, the visible velocity is pretty much unchanged. We still do the same number of points in a sprint, but compared to this time last year, now every single card that works its way through our Agile board goes through QA. Never would have happened before. Every single thing that we add, well, most things, gets wireframes, even if it's a simple change. And there's this level of depth that we've never actually achieved before, and we actually spend less money than we did the same time last year. So it's been really great for us, and I think you should try it out. Thank you.
Who knows? Hey?
Hey, thanks, Mike, for your talk. I wanted to ask if you're now only recruiting people with no experience, and I don't know if you're planning to size up your team, but are you planning to make these baristas become senior developers someday and really take over this charge? And if you do plan to do so, how long do you think it will take?
That's a great question. So if we look at what our on paper our goals are, it's 2 years, right? And I feel pretty confident based on when we've done this sort of experimentally in the past and not as part of a real process. Actually, one example is our current lead developer at the company who I now trust like everything to pretty much, and generally like does more work than me and fixes more stuff than I'm able to. She started in 2012 as my personal assistant. She started coding HTML and CSS for we had this Fortune 500 company's project, but like just this weirdly specific part of it. And so that was her first like real solid production HTML and CSS work, I guess, in the winter of 2013. She got to where she was doing all front-end code, like deep DOM interactions, and basically being what I would call a senior front-end developer by 2015. And that was really only limited by how much practice we were able to give her. By 2017, she was doing full stack work, dealing with database migrations, dealing with random shell scripts to fix like CRM data and stuff. And like in 2018, now she like just deals with like a lot of things that normally I had to deal with, and she like maintains a large part of Salesforce. So I don't know exactly the answer. I will say we actually lost a member of our team recently, just through mishap, nothing that he did, nothing that we wanted to happen. But that person was able to get placed in a job that was looking for someone with 5 years of experience in less than 24 hours after they left. And that person had been with us for 5 months. So I was really happy.
Okay, thanks for your talk, Mike. I was wondering if you have some sort of process in order to give your developers more responsibilities as your apprentices, more responsibilities as they grow. I mean, how do you know if they're ready to code something that's more complex? And also, I was wondering if you have like a development ladder for them. Like, I'm guessing that they don't go from apprentice to senior developer, right? I'm guessing you have like a curve.
Totally, yeah. So like that's what I want to get to, where that's like real. Right now it's all just like in my head, mainly. I have this whole like this thing here with like milestones and these levels. But right now this is just like crazy Mike late at night kind of stuff. Where we're at is like everyone is like right here, right? And they're hitting these prerequisites. And like what I'm imagining is like when they get to that 2-year mark, like they hit this ladder where like I want them to stay, so like I buy them like a leather jacket, and they get like a sabbatical and stuff. But we haven't really, it hasn't happened yet because we're just now trying out this more like formalized approach. In the past, what it was more just like, hey, you're my friends, can I hire you? I'll teach you how to code, right? So yeah, totally, that's where this is going, 100%. The first part of your question, did you ask whether their rate goes up? I didn't quite hear. Sorry.
Yeah, I'll just shout. No, I was wondering if there's a way that you measure if they're ready to... If there's a way that you can measure if they're ready to take more complex tasks, or do you just like trust your other developers for them to make the choices of what they should develop or not?
Yeah. So honestly, it's largely based on feeling it out, right? And whether they fail when you assign a task. So if you follow the personal rule, like I'm going to assign a task that I think they're going to succeed with, then if they don't succeed with it, it means it's time to back up a little bit, right? And then maybe it's time to like make sure that you really covered the theory that they were missing. Maybe they didn't respond to a customer. Maybe you asked them to deal with, hey, can you like respond to this customer, let them know that it's been taken care of and it's live on production, but then they don't respond for like 3 hours. Then probably it's time not to get all corny, but just to use the way they would teach you this at Starbucks when you're learning to be like a learning coach. It was like, okay, we need to have a coaching conversation, like take that person back to like those important topics and be like, okay, so here's why this didn't work out. You know, it's not your fault. I probably like didn't emphasize it enough. Let's try again next time. So I think it's more just like you always try to push them forward, but based on how much you think they'll be able to succeed. And if they fail, dial it back.
Yep. There is one there.
Hello, Mike. Thanks for the talk. I was wondering if you have tried this with UI design or something like that, because I know it works with code, but I don't know if you have developed a method with design.
So I'm not like the right person to ask because as it is, it's like pulling teeth to get customers to pay for design in my experience, which is terrible because like I really want them to. And now it's to the point where we've just baked that into our cost. So we have a designer on retainer that we just pay to make sure that like, okay, sometimes when stuff's like obviously ugly, we can like send it to him and they don't even have to know they're paying for it, but that way like it'll actually look better. And like we can write our name on it and be happy, you know? So that's how we do design right now. The most recent person that I hired in this role, part of the reason why I picked them was because they had a lot of cool art on their LinkedIn profile and like fingers crossed like they're gonna be able to help us out with that.
¿Más preguntas?
Hi, Mike. Do you think mentoring apprentices with no technical background has helped you and your fellow senior devs to improve in your profession as opposed to mentoring junior devs?
Oh yeah, for sure. Because it makes you realize like, what is it that I'm even doing right now, right? Like, I never even really thought about, like, I've thought so much about how annoying it is to install all of our dev tools because we've taught other people to do it, that it's made me like, make that process better. It's made hiring easier. And even if these were like, if I was hiring senior developers and we were trying to get them plugged into the same process, like we would have the same problems, right? So now that we've done it for a fraction of the cost, taught people a lot of great career skills along the way, and like it's made us better at hiring. And it's definitely made us better at communicating. I don't know if it's made us better at coding, but it's made our code better.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Hi, Mike. I would like to ask you a little bit about age and other things what might affect your choice of people.
Oh, I can neither confirm nor deny anything related to age and hiring. But yeah, I mean, I don't look at it, honestly. So the oldest person I've taught to code turned 50 about halfway through the process. That's the only reason I even knew how old he was. He's turning 50, so it was a big deal. The youngest person I've taught to code, probably myself, actually. And the youngest person that's taught me to code was this intern we had named Zoli, who, when we went to lunch one day, added CSRF protection to sales, and then we came back and it was done. So he's my inspiration about that. I think age has no meaning. And you know, yesterday, one of the keynote speakers, Alistair, he said he had some French classes before, but he learned French in 3 months, and he gave his talk in Spanish, and he'd only been doing that for like 15 months, spread over 5 years. So like like if that's possible, then anybody can learn anything.
There is one there.
Hi, Mike. Over here. Mike, there.
Oh, sorry.
Well, thanks for the talk. Have you ever considered making the content of your training program public? And even more than that, the experience you have gained doing that all this time. We all know there's a lack of software developers in the world. So.
That's a great question. Honestly, like, yeah, I've considered it, and then I got afraid that, like, because I made all these notes, kind of crazy Mike, late at night, and I was afraid I put like sensitive stuff in there. But actually, this talk, because I went and I like blacked all that stuff out, so I could show it to you guys. Like, that's actually kind of the first step. So, I don't know when it'll happen. I can never prioritize it because it's not, you know, the immediate next thing that we have to look at. But like, yeah, I would love to make it more available.
Hello, Mike. Wondering if you heard the term pair programming.
If I heard the what?
Pair programming.
Pair programming. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Do you do pair programming often or not in your
Pair
your
programming,
company?
yeah. So I'm sorry. Was there more to the question? I don't want to cut you off because I think you're the last question. Okay. So pair programming is a great way to teach someone to do something, and it's a great way to get quality code. And even in theory, it's really tied, right, to kind of what we're talking about today, because you have usually one person that's slightly less experienced, one person that's more experienced. Ideally, the less experienced person types. It takes a lot of time, and it's a big investment in somebody. I'm not sure it's the best investment for the business when somebody's at this stage, right, when they're at the apprentice stage. But once they are, so part of actually, I was talking about that the developer who worked for me that's now our lead developer, her trajectory was in 2015, she and I spent every day pair programming 8 hours a day for about 3 months. And that was like a huge time investment. It made a huge difference. A lot of it too was just the thing we were doing at that time was really difficult, and I was having a bunch of headaches. So it worked out, and it made sense for the business at that time.
Ok, démosle las gracias a Mike, un fuerte aplauso.